The other day, on the back of the big blue Jeep that was trundling through a Jerusalem side street, it was the bumper sticker that caught my eye. "Olmert is bad for the Jews," it read. The standout distaste for Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert was plastered amid a galaxy of messages insisting that Israel not give up land in the West Bank, mourn last year's withdrawal from Gaza, and support settlers everywhere. Contrast that with the thunderous cheers which Ehud Olmert received when he addressed a joint session of the two houses of the United States Congress during his inaugural visit to Washington a couple of weeks ago. The applause was no more heartfelt, it seemed, than when the Israeli leader gave an emphatic pledge: "We shall not give in to terror. We shall not give in to terror." Now, another contrast. This comes from Jeff Jacoby, or Jacoby, I'm not sure how the name is pronounced, an esteemed columnist in the Boston Globe newspaper. Castigating the Olmert vision of Israel's future, he pulls no punches, saying that Israel cannot afford to succumb to the delusion that retreating in the face of terror will bring safety and peace of mind. Wars are not won by evacuations, he says, though he does add, Israelis, weary after so many years under siege, wish to pretend otherwise. It's up to their friends to tell them the truth, he concludes. It's a view of not a small number of Israel's self-declared friends, the likes of whom the Prime Minister might have not heard in the White House or Congress, but which were conveyed on US television while he was in the country. The ads were sponsored by a Washington think tank called the Center for Security Policy, which projects itself as committed to pursuing international strength through American strength. The centre has long proclaimed itself a supporter of Israel, but the TV ad was harshly critical of Olmert's proposed realignment or Convergence Plan in the West Bank. That is, his planned significant withdrawal, which will include the uprooting of over a third of the Jewish settlers who live in the area. Albert Einstein, said the ad, defined insanity as doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. We cannot afford any more of this insanity. A pointed reference to Israel's unilateral withdrawal from Gaza last summer and the planned Olmert pullback within the next couple of years in the West Bank. There were other echoes of dismay expressed by other self-declared supporters of Israel in the US. Dismay at the realignment policy. In the Wall Street Journal, the former CIA director James Woolsey asserted that what he called the foreseeable result of the Olmert plan, that is, in his view, the creation of a West Bank terrorist state, would mortally threaten not only Israel, but also its pro-Western, pro-Washington neighbor, Jordan. Territorial surrender, said Woolsey, given approval by Washington, would signal that we, the United States that is reverting to earlier behavior patterns, leaving Lebanon in 1983, acquiescing in Saddam Hussein's persecution of Kurdish and Shiite rebels in 1991, and fleeing Somalia in 1993. Behavior patterns, it was argued, that eventually led to the murderous assault on the US of September 11th. Like that bumper sticker on the Jerusalem Jeep, all perfectly legitimate criticism of Israeli policy. Only one thing wrong with it: the questionable angle of vision. Don't get me wrong when I suggest that this criticism in the United States is questionable. It's not at all the case often advanced by some Israelis that no one who lives outside Israel and is not subject to the same concerns, the same threats, the same fears about survival has the right to tell Israel what to do, or even advise her what to do, or to be critical, even, as in this case, harshly critical of Israeli policy. It's certainly not the argument that's often used to be advanced in Israel against Jews abroad, telling them to keep their noses out of Israeli politics, since it was maintained, in the final instance, someone outside Israel doesn't have to pay the consequences of policies affecting those spheres of existence or threats against their existence. Not at all. Everyone has the right to an opinion, to criticism, however harsh. What is suspect, however, from an Israeli point of view, is when the criticism of Olmert's withdrawal policy is made through American eyes, not Israeli eyes, when it's definitely within the prism of what's good for America, rather than what's good for Israel. However much Israel regards itself as a loyal ally of the United States, and Olmert, when he spoke to Congress, could not have bettered the enunciation of how much Israel identifies with the US war on global terror, it's the debate over what's really good for Israel which ought to be the focus of attention here. And in this respect, perhaps explaining the dismay of Olmert's critics in Washington, the people of Israel do, by and large, seem to have been convinced that the time has come, after nearly 40 years of being in control of the West Bank, for Israel to find another way to enhance and ensure its security. Perhaps what's really got the gander of these US critics is the way in which Olmert made so plain that Israel has already made up its mind that it no longer wants to control most of the West Bank, an area regarded by the majority of Israelis not as an asset, but as a burden. The editorial writer of the prestigious Tel Aviv daily Haaretz put it succinctly. It might also be seen as a response to that harsh bumper sticker in considering what in fact is good for the Jews. Israel must begin the withdrawal the sooner the better, wrote the paper. Not because the Americans agree and not because there's no partner on the Palestinian side for a withdrawal by agreement, but because Israel has a clear and immediate interest in further reducing the occupation and Israeli control over Palestinian lives, as well as in creating the preconditions for the establishment of a Palestinian state free of an Israeli presence altogether. Although, as I say, the majority of Israelis seem to be lined up with the Olmert position, many, for this or that reason, are not. And many, like those parading that angry bumper sticker against their Prime Minister, will not hesitate to voice their views and to battle him all the way. Indeed, the debate is sure to rage, indeed, right up to and beyond when the Prime Minister is in fact able to carry through his realignment policy to fruition. But what's critical is that the debate will rage not over what's good for America, where also, of course, there will be disputes over just how best to run the global war on terror, but what is, in the final analysis, really good for Israel.